Good morning, my friends, truth seekers and interested parties. Today we're going to do a special video on EasyLubes. As most people know, there is a little fitting on the front of the spindle on an axle that you can pump grease into, and it's supposed to grease your bearings. So we're going to test that. Let me get you a little closer so you can actually see what's going on. Okay, so this is known as the spindle of the axle. And you have a rear bearing that goes way back in here, like that, and a front bearing that goes on here, like that. And you also have a seal that goes way back here like this. So this goes way back on here, right up against the seal, okay? And this one goes in the front. Now these don't have any grease on them. These are brand new bearings, greaseless. And what we're going to do is we're going to pump some grease into that zert feeding and see if it puts grease into these bearings. Now, of course, we're going to put the hub on first. So let's take that off. Put that down here. Take this off. Put that over here. And we got to carefully take this off. And we got to put that in here. Okay, so you see this little hole way back here? That's where the grease comes out. We've got some green grease here today. All right, there's the grease. It's coming out. So that's what we're going to be putting in now. Let's see how that zert fitting works. You put this in here, lock that on there like that, push some grease, and you can see there's blue grease coming out down here. That's because the inside of the spindle is full of blue grease. Now we want green grease to come out. This is really no easy task. Alright. Got the green grease is just beginning to get there. And when you change greases on your bearings, you really have to make sure that you're getting the right grease to the bearings. So I think that's pretty close. I'm going to give it 2 more pumps. Alright, I think that's pretty green enough. Alright, so that's how the EasyLube works. So now, alright, we're going to put these dry bearings, no grease on them. They're not packed, they haven't been taken care of at all. This is the back one, goes right in there. And the seal goes on top of it as it's supposed to be. Hammer. Excuse me, fellas. All right, the seal's in there. Nice, even. I'm going to put the front bearing in its race. And the washer and the castle nut will go on this and get it on the spindle. So pick that up and carefully put it on the spindle. Front bearing come out because it wasn't stuck in there with any grease. The back bearing went in good. All right, I'll put on the castle nut. I don't have the socket for this, but we'll tighten it down a little and loosen it up. I don't have a cotter pin, so I'm going to use a, there. So we got wheeling, it rolls. All right. So now we take our grease gun. We're going to put just 10 squirts in here, and when you squirt it, you gotta move the wheel. You got enough strength to squirt it and move the wheel at the same time. Oh, I can tell it's getting greased because it's getting easier. Now you might be doing this with the tire on, which is okay, but when you do it, you have to move the wheel. You can't just do it on the ground and squirt grease into the wheel, because it's not going to go into the bearing. It's going to bunch up and go through the back of the seal. And it gets considerably harder when I'm not turning this thing. All right, now let's see what we got. We'll take our cotter pin out, our fake cotter pin, take our nut off. Now we know we didn't put enough grease in to get the front bearing, so we know the front bearing is going to be dry. Okay, this comes right off, the front bearing in the washer. Nothing got to here because we just didn't pump in enough grease. Okay, now take off the back, and we can see the grease is inside the seal. It didn't break through the seal. All right, and there's nothing back on the back of the brake lining, nothing underneath here, so the seal kept it in there because we kept the wheel running. Now let's see what the actual bearing looks like. Right, we'll pull the bearing out. This is not a good way to do it, but we're going to do it this way anyways. All right, the seal has a lot of, see, I broke the seal, the spring came out. Seal's got a lot of grease on one side, but not on all sides. And the bearing has grease on it, but not a whole lot. Not as much grease as you might consider in there. And it is in the crack. The bearing has grease on it, but not as much as I would have thought. So to get grease in that bearing, you really have to empty your gun, your grease gun. Now there's grease down here in the between the bearing and the seal. But as you can see on the bearing, there's no grease up in here. I'm putting some on from my fingers right at the moment, but I probably, if I had had a helper, I probably could have got enough grease in there to grease these bearings. But you can see the grease on the back of the bearing was evenly spread and was working its way into the bearing. This bearing is really packed now with grease. It won't turn because there's so much grease in it, and when I do turn it, the grease comes out the bottom. So it's obviously got a good amount of grease. So if you continue to pack that until the grease comes all the way through to the front, you're going to get your bearings well greased. The problem, of course, is where does all the dirt and dust and other stuff go on your bearings? Because as I showed you before, this is how your bearings are sitting on your shaft when the drum is on there. And there's you know, a lot of space in the drum. It goes across here, you know, a big hollow tube, and all this open space has to be full of grease for it to get from this bearing to this bearing. And yes, if you're turning them and they're moving along, that grease is going to work its way forward, and it's going to be probably a pretty good grease job if you get it all the way through. But all of this grease that's in here, this big thick pancake of grease that's around this spindle, does nothing. It just sits there, and when you move the grease from this bearing into that reservoir, you're putting all the dirt and grime and grease and everything into that spindle area. So then you're pushing it into the next bearing. So it's not the best situation. Really, you should pop your bearings if you think you're deficient in grease. Pump the grease in until you see the grease come out. See how bad the grease coming out looks. If it's the same bright color that you're putting in there, which is why I like to use a red grease, because it, you know, when it turns gray, you know there's a lot of wear going on in here. But it's easier to pop the wheel off. You got to take the tire off. It takes one nut, pull the drum off, or the hub off, or whatever you've got, and look at the bearings inside the hub. If they look well greased and clean, you're probably all right. You can drop this one out and repack it by hand. You can use the bearing buddy to pack the back one and then go on your way. Easy peasy. It'll take you 20 minutes plus the time to pump the gun 20 times at least. I did 10 times, and you can see that I wasn't getting enough grease into the bearing. So 20 times might be enough, but we got grease in there. There's grease in that bearing. It's just not all the way through. And as the bearing works and moves and turns around, it'll probably get that grease distributed through all the little bearing rollers. But you can see how the EasyLube works really well on the back bearing. It doesn't work as well on the front bearing unless you really empty your gun to get all that grease through it. And again, you got to make sure your grease is equal. It doesn't matter what color it is, but on the tube it'll say whether it's a lithium based, a urea based, a poly, a couple of different types of grease, but make sure your grease is consistent. So what I say is I always buy Lucas Red and Tacky. You can buy Mobile One bearing grease is good grease. There's some other Kendall makes some good bearing greases, but take care of your bearings. They keep your wheels rolling. I think the conclusion is EasyLubes work just fine. You just have to remember, get your tire off the ground, roll it around, keep it moving, and keep it pumping. You really need two people. You don't, unless you got more strength than I do to pump that. And you can tell what's coming out. You can look at the grease coming out and tell that it's dirty or not. All right, folks. So I hope you're with me in the belief that the EasyLube works just fine when it's used the way it's supposed to. I don't know if it's a real good test with a totally dry bearing. If the bearing had been packed properly before putting in there, that grease would have just moved right through. But it's actually a good way to pack a bearing if you're going to do it. You know, if we had pumped it enough to get the grease all the way through that spindle and out the front bearing, then we would have known that both bearings were completely packed. I hope you understand now what you need to do if you use an EasyLube. Don't just hook up and pump with an auto gun, because you'll just blow out the seal and contaminate your brakes. And if you have a bad seal, it's probably a good idea to pull the drum and look at your seal to make sure your seal's working and everything's good. And then if you want to put grease in the bearings, put the drum back on and use the EasyLube. But it's a pretty good engineered product. I think there's a lot of people that curse them on the internet, and I think it's because they don't know how they work. All right, thanks for watching. We got a lot more trailer maintenance tips coming up. Follow the channel for that, and we hope to see you on the next one. Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.